Grüß Gott und guten Abend zum ersten Subnet-Talk hier im Zentrum nach dem Sommer. Ich darf heute den Martin begrüßen. Ich will ganz kurz zum Format ein paar Worte verlieren. Und zwar, das Format ist auf eine Stunde begrenzt. Martin wird ungefähr 25 Minuten sprechen, plus minus. Daraufhin ist die Hoffnung, dass wir in eine Art von Gruppendialog hineinwanken. Die Kameras werden laufen die ganze Zeit, auch während der Fragestunde. Wir werden aber so aufgezeichnet werden, dass man uns nicht erkennt, wurde mir gesagt von FS1. Passt, in diesem Sinne. Martin kommt zu uns aus Linz. Eine letzte Frage habe ich noch. Gibt es irgendjemanden, der Probleme mit Englisch hat? Weil es wurde die Bitte geäußert, dass wir den Vortrag doch auf Englisch halten würden. Ist es okay? Passt, dann ist es entschieden. Okay, then we continue in English. Martin comes to us from Linz. He is just recently became head of the Department of Tangible Music Lab at the University of Kunstuniversität Linz. Before that, he was researching in Barcelona and at the MIT in Dublin. He's been working also as a Instrumentenbauer.
Luthier.
What?
Luthier.
Luthier?
Luthier.
Luthier.
Yeah.
Luthier. Okay, I didn't know that word. And okay. And so before I embarrass myself any further, I would like you to please start.
Okay.
And we're going to listen.
Thanks for the invitation to come to Salzburg. Actually, it's the first time, if I remember right, that I'm talking here. As I was introduced, I'm working at the art school in Linz, but my background is actually, as many of you here, at that lab in human-computer interaction, so I hope that I don't really preach to the choir too much. So my motivation was always to, well, since we have since the Industrial Revolution, forced to work with machines in many, many different ways, I was driven with this kind of love-hate relationship to improve this the everyday dealing with machines. And if you look at the kind of history of human-machine interaction, like in the 19th century, it was really mostly driven of the functioning of the machine, of the production needs, what those machines can do for us, and not so much of the needs of the human being who need to operate them. So even if when the digital age started in the 1950s, when the first big mainframe computers started, also these machines were merely defined by the technology they were made of. No, they basically there was no thinking about to make them user-friendly at that time, because at that time people were thinking to make them functional in the first place, so they could make their necessary computations. So people who basically built those machines at that time were those who were the only ones who were able to operate them. I was making a little shortcut now in the history and already jumped to the 1970s. So in between, there was a lot of developments, of course, that people developed, for example, terminal interaction with the computers. So they were using those TTI, teletype interfaces to make this kind of spoken or written dialogue with the machines, which they called somehow like an electronic brain at that time, assuming that had already a kind of artificial intelligence. But this led quite quickly somehow with this teletype interface, and later with the graphical representation of computational content, it led to this idea of the direct manipulation interface of the GUI, which was developed at the Xerox PARC Research Center in the early 70s, and actually still defines more or less what the computer looks like today. It comes from this kind of terminal idea that we have this teletype thing to make a language interaction with the computer, and it comes from this kind of graphical representations in order to interact directly with graphical data. So if you look what happened after that in the 1970s and 80s, when basically this industrial revolution went into the digital revolution, so many traditional techniques and cultural techniques, like for example print, which had a very long century-old tradition of how to make this print process with the lead letters and arrange them later on, like cutting out paper and arranging and copying them. It was very, very physical cultural techniques. It became transferred into the digital domain. No? So in the 80s, there was the buzzword of desktop publishing. We had the first personal computers with PageMaker at that time, and most importantly, the laser printer, which allowed us to do what professionals were doing at the workshops before, and they needed special training for that. Suddenly, you could do that at home with the special equipment, like this universal equipment of the personal computer. So, of course, you could say at that time, so we had desktop publishing, it was repeating to all other kind of trades like architecture, for example. We had this computer-aided design, and people before were drawing plans by hand, and suddenly they had this universal tool of the computer, and they could do also architecture and kind of make the plans digitally. So many professions like print setting, architecture, and many, many more since the 1980s, 70s transferred onto this kind of digital domain. If you look at our daily personal practice of media production and consumption, so like photography, communication, telephony, music consumption, and so on, all these kind of activities in the pre-digital age had their dedicated devices and culture around it. Yeah? So, of course, this converged now, also in the last decades, into these universal single-purpose devices which we have in all our pockets. Now, whatever was the camera before, whatever was the postcard, whatever was the music player before, converged into this single super device, which is, of course, cool, because we can do things with that. We needed many different devices before, and with a single purchase, expensive purchase, of course, we can do all those things in a single interface. So apparently this kind of interfaces, both the desktop graphical terminals and the mobile graphical touch interfaces, are very powerful and universal tools which allow us to do many, many things. But of course, there's also a drawback to it. If you look at these graphics from Dan O'Sullivan from the book Physical Computing, this is a representation of what the computer may think how we look like, how we interact with the computer. Because if the computer were in fact really an artificial intelligence, it just can maybe sense what we do with it. And the only thing we do with a graphical interface, be it touch, single touch, mouse driven or multi-touch, is like pointing and selecting things on the screen all the time. So on the desktop computer, this is still a very productive interface because we have the type machine and other kind of interfaces to work productively. But I hardly have seen anybody really work productively a lot on this kind of touch interfaces, although they are really seem very intuitively. And the problem here is that those devices, they reduce the human being to a kind of weird creature, which is only kind of pointing and selecting and moving these direct manipulation processes on the screen. So I've explained this very rough introduction, which I usually do in a longer talk, but today I only have 25 minutes. So there's, of course, much more to it. So I will jump quickly to our own field of research, because we work in the field of music. And we called ourselves a team in Barcelona I was working with for many years. We called ourselves at that time digital luthiers, so digitale Musikinstrumentenbauer. So we have been confronted as musicians and as instrument builders. We have been confronted with the same development somehow, as we have seen in architecture and in print production. So if you look at the traditional acoustic musical instruments, they had like a centuries-old tradition to make these typical wind instruments, string instrument, and kind of idiophones, which are kind of all types of vibrating bodies. And this has been done so for 30,000 years. So there was bone flutes, for example, in the earlier days, which basically the same design as the saxophone, but people changed the kind of craft, they changed the materials, they changed the size and so on, and try to improve the way the instrument sounds like. But of course, with acoustic instruments, you're basically bound to physics. You cannot really make like a tiny, tiny saxophone and then make it sound in a low pitch. That's not possible because physics does not allow it. So, long story short, the same process happened with this kind of additional traditional craft, but there was one step in between. There was electronic music. So electronic music suddenly allowed instrument builders and musicians to escape of these limitations of acoustic traditional physics, sound physics productions. So you could make a machine, in this case it's an electronic analog synthesizer machine, which virtually can produce any kind of sound you can imagine. So there was no limit anymore what kind of unheard sounds at that time you could create. So, for example, if you would see a 1950s movies, you would hear a theremin sound in the background, and it was kind of spooky because those kind of sounds were unknown so far. Nowadays, of course, electronic music is something very commonplace. But as you can see also in this nice synthesizer picture is that there's a problem now. If you have this universal machine which has so many possibilities to create any kind of sounds as I want, then I have the problem of control. Suddenly I have like really this myriad of control points which I can possibly not control at the same time with my bare hands. And this is also imposed by the process of the next step of digitalization. So whatever happened in architecture and print design also happened to music. So it converged from a kind of cultural technique of, let's say, playing acoustical instruments through electronic music. It converged into the laptop, no? Because the laptop nowadays is the universal machine for making architecture, print setting, and music. And what you may see usually on stage is something a scene like that. You see some people making music, making a very unmotivated face and make the music and kind of control the process, which is hardly to tell if it's really in real time or just recorded playback. And the problem here is basically not the motivation and the computer as such and the interface as such, but it's a kind of bandwidth, the limitation which you cannot expect from an office tool, which is now, on the one hand, very universal and powerful, but on the other hand, it's so universal that you can do so many things, but nothing really specially with it. Yeah? And especially for music, that's a big problem, because you would like to leverage the human capabilities. You would not like to reduce yourself to this kind of pointing finger creature, which is just like making music with your fingertip. You know? If you make music, you would expect something like that, no? You could not really make a really, let's say, expressive performance on a laptop keyboard. No? So of course, people get around it and they make controllers and they plug in different stuff and kind of try to make the special interfaces, kind of musical interfaces, which are often inspired by traditional instruments, but also inspired by kind of more technical approaches. So the question is really here, when we look at this development now, so we have, of course, now very powerful technologies, yeah, which are really good that we have them. But at the same time, those technologies apparently define very much the design of interfaces of our everyday activities. No? If you look at the history of the mobile phone design, it was really for a long time, the size and appearance was really just based on the possibilities of what we can do technically, no? Because you could not make that phone smaller at that time because the circuitry and the batteries and whatever, they needed that space. But there was some kind of sweet spot maybe in 2005 when the iPhone apparently came out, that suddenly this technology was small enough, cheap enough, and available enough, so you could think about other things. Yeah? So you could think about more, let's say, human factors in the design and think more about the user, what they want to do with it, and suddenly this idea of miniaturization was given up, and now it gets back again because people think big screens are now a more important thing. So long story short, the question I'm imposing now is it really now, when you talk about virtual reality, for example, should it be the next step of digitalization of the digital age? Should we like put everything into the screen at this aquarium of the laptop, or should we put everything into virtual reality, just disconnect completely from physical interaction? Or should we maybe take a different approach of saying, okay, why don't we, instead of transferring everything physical onto the screen, like for example in the desktop interface from 1970s, basically we put our office desktop into the screen, right? So why don't we do the other way around? Why don't we embed digital technology and digital information into our physical world? So it's just the other way around. And the good thing is now with the technology we have, so we have like this really miniaturized, cheap technology, we can make things smart in the end. So if you look again at very basic cultural techniques we have, so we could have like this idea of building blocks. No? Why could we have this idea of atomic interfaces where simple artifacts like these simple blocks, which by themselves don't mean anything, but in combining them you can create a structure, which could of course also be filled with a, let's say, a digital meaning. Why cannot we put those objects, those simple physical artifacts, into a certain context in order to program them? If you look at the checkers board, the checker pieces by themselves, they are meaningless. They're just tokens, right? But if you put them on a checkers board, or if you put them on a Mühle board, which is a different environment, I don't know the English word for the Mühle game, then suddenly you program, you impose a certain behavior with this reference frame to them. So suddenly those stones, those tokens get a certain meaning from the environment. So on the one hand, you could use this idea of constructive assemblies, where you combine physical things and make bigger things out of it, out of a meaningless simple element. And you can put these elements in a context where you kind of impose a certain behavior to them. And this brings me to one of my major projects I've been involved in the last years, which is called the Rectable, which is a musical instrument which basically tried to overcome those limitations of electronic music practice. So we wanted, on the one hand, we wanted an interface which allows us to make this electronic music, like, I don't know, sample playing, sequencers, modular synthesizers, and so on. So all this kind of practice which we had in the kind of, let's say, analog world of electronic music, which was transferred then to the computer. We wanted to get back again into the physical world and make an instrument which is kind of feels like more like a physical artifact. I will show you a short video so you get an idea in case you didn't see it before. So what we try again when we have this kind of physical interface, yeah, we try to leverage some of the physiological and cognitive potential of people. So we try to like involve the whole bodily possibilities. And we are thinking of a more human-centered interaction design. So if you think like of this little iconic image here, so if you think of a little child who is kind of already an expert in block gaming somehow, so all those capabilities we acquire in a very early age in our development later on appear to us as what we call intuitive. No? So we try to use something which is kind of having a very low entrance level to play with, a kind of really child's play, a very ludic approach to electronic music, but at the same time gives us, of course, the possibility of a professional development and learning it in more detail. So if you look at the recipe, what we have on the Rectable is more or less this classical modular synthesizer, which is really composed of, for example, oscillators, filters, and controllers, for example. That would be the typical elements which we have there. We have some kind of element of sound visualization, so we have this multimodal experience. We don't only have the sound, but we have a visual representation at the same time of the sound. And at the same time, we try to have this physical representation of the sound elements. So all those elements which we could see in the synthesizer, like I said, oscillators, sample players, filters, sound effects, controllers, and so on, they are kind of embodied into these physical blocks. They kind of appear to the user that they are kind of inside. And this idea exists for a while in the kind of, when we look again in this kind of transformation in the digital age. So all these kind of flow control languages like PD, Maximus P, V4, and so on, these visual programming languages, they follow in principle this idea of a modular synthesizer, putting them into the virtual domain, and we kind of just to the next step and bring it back to the physical domain again by embodying all those elements in a physical block. So what the Rectable basically is all these simple physical blocks which are just really plastic. There's nothing inside, there's no electronics and so on. The only thing which is there are simple symbols which allow us to track them with a camera system so we can identify them and locate them on a table. So this is how it looks like, more or less. So you have a round table, a simple table surface, where you can locate and manipulate and relate those simple objects together. And whatever you would do in a programming language like PD and Maximus P, in case some of you have been trying that before, you can do that at the same time in a similar way on that table. The only thing is that you would choose those objects, like you would choose an oscillator and I would choose a filter and I choose a controller and relate them and make little arrangements and have this kind of real-time physical sound programming language in a certain way. So let me show you a quick video so you get maybe a better idea than what I could explain here. So what you see here is a video of a guy who bought that instrument from us a few years ago, an Italian DJ, and you see a simple scene of how he arranges a track, which is his musical style somehow. And what you see on the table is not sounding yet because he is pre-arranging certain elements like filters and other elements which are necessary for a later. So you see the table in the center is fluctuating and everything is then flowing towards the center and he's setting up things. So you see now a delay here, a filter, another delay, and this object is a general object which defines the tonality. So once he puts the oscillator on the table now, this is just a simple oscillator like you would know from a modular synthesizer. It's recognized by the system and emits the simple square wave sounds to the center. And since we have that delay in between, it applies the delay effect to it. Yeah? And you can see also he can rotate the object and changes the frequency, the pitch of that oscillator at the same time. And there's some lateral controls in the interface where you can also change the amplitude and loudness of that object. But of course, you can see that this is a very elementary, simple objects, but by combining them, you can create complex structures. So this, for example, is just a simple sample player, a cube, which has a pre-recorded loop inside. And this loop now travels through a filter and a delay. And now by turning the filter, he's doing this typical filter cliché of electronic music. So in this case, we have pre-recorded samples. In this case, it's a modular synthesizer. So we combine many elements of traditional electronic music. So this is a new element. Usually in modular synthesizer, we would control elements like sequencers. Yeah? And this is basically a simple melody sequence, which is pre-programmed and now triggering that oscillator. So instead of doing the frequency yourself, you can do that with a automatic controller object. So I just wait until the next object, which is the beat, of course, which is still missing, and then I can continue. I think you can get the picture more or less. Yeah, so this was more or less the function of the rec table. And that's what we tried with this interface. So we tried, as I said before, to kind of combine all the traditional elements of electronic music, again, modular synthesizers, sequencers, and sample players, and other sound elements, of course, into a more, let's say, intuitive physical representation to create an interface which is not limited to this typical office computer, right? But musically, you cannot do very much more than you would do with other instruments. So some elements of the rec table I mentioned before is, for example, the visual representation. So that's not only something we use for the players themselves, so they can see what's happening on the table, but it's usually also something we use for the audience, so we don't have to pay a VJ, basically, because people can follow what the musician is doing. It's a different quality than you would have from laptop interfaces, because that's not very interesting to follow people on their screen activities. Another very important aspect which you can derive from going physical is that you can make collaborative interfaces. Because if you have a resource like a computer keyboard or a single mouse, it's something you have to fight about. It's made for one person. But we, from the very beginning, designed the rec table as a collaborative musical instrument. So that's also the reason why we made it a round table, because that's the typical metaphor of collaboration, of getting together, of discussing. And also it's a very good way of allowing all peers the same access at the same time. And you can basically, what we know from graphical interfaces is the idea of graphical of direct manipulation. That's something you really can do in a much more extended way on the physical layer. So one thing in our practice was very important. So we have been geeks, basically making an instrument. So we wanted always to collaborate with artists. So on the one hand is making the instrument, the other thing is playing the instrument. So the very first concert, for example, we commissioned a composer, Chris Brown in this case, to write the piece. And this was a very important step for us also to rethink how we designed that thing. So of course, we as designers had our ideas and so on, but giving it away is always a very, very important thing for a musical instrument. You have to create, of course, material, literature for it, but also it's good for the development of the instrument itself, because a composer has a different mindset than an engineer would have. Another thing which was also important, we also worked with other musicians, like Björk was one of the first customers who was using the instrument in live shows. So this was also very important again for us to have a kind of more reality check from, let's say, experimental academic music to more popular electronic music. And later on, we even had the chance to develop a kind of, let's say, more commercial approach to commercialize and sell the instrument, which was reasonably successful, but actually now after 10 years we are thinking about closing the company because it's as a niche product. We can sell it, but it's nothing really which you can become rich from. So probably in the next year or so we are going to stop that adventure. So to conclude, maybe let me just show you a few other activities which we are doing in Linz now, because this Rectable project, of course, was very good to show you this idea of post-digital physical interaction design. But now in Linz at the Tangible Music Lab, we are trying to continue this tradition in different angles. So there, I have a few collaborators, like 5-6 collaborators at the moment, and we are also working in general in human-computer interaction, tangible user interfaces, that's the genre we are working in, like the Rectable, and musical interaction design. So we make physical, tangible musical instruments. That's the major activity. And on the contrary, what we called in Barcelona at that time when I was working there, what we called digital luthiers, we are calling it this way now, kind of post-digital luthiers, because I think this is keying it much better to kind of try to get together this kind of heritage of cultural techniques of musical instrument design and combine it with the advantages of digital technologies and kind of see what we can get out of both of them. So one of my collaborators, for example, is Jens Vetter. He's a PhD student who is starting this October now, but I have already been collaborating with him in a little side project which we call the T-Quencer. It's very similar to the Rectable, but it's a smaller sized and cheaper thing, and it's basically only a single sequencer, not this kind of full-fledged modular synthesizer. But the advantage of that thing is that it's portable and self-contained and just usable right away. And we follow a similar idea here that we represent the sound events of a simple sequence in little blocks. So here we focus on the tangible musical interaction design. But as you can see, this is very simple on the first place, but we have been thinking of a way how we can increase the complexity of the way we can program this interface. So we introduced something like windows, like layers, so you could create different instrument layers very quickly on that surface, although it only has a limited physical extension. Another collaborator is Enrique Tomas. He has been doing, he's going to finish the first PhD student who's going to finish in this November. And he has been working in a project called Tangible Scores. That's quite interesting from the perspective of physical embodiment, because here what we are trying is to embody, physically represent the score of a piece, of a musical piece. So in some way we are creating let's say, a hybrid between a musical score, which comes from the idea of a graphic score, a visual representation of contemporary music. We try to embody this visual representation into the physical appearance of the instrument. So it's a score at the same time which suggests what to play, and at the same time it's a musical instrument. So there's an experimental thing which actually has been working out quite nicely. So this is the first iteration. We see it's a surface scratching thing, but now in the recent years, Kike has experimented much more with different materials and physical appearances, how to represent music as a physical thing. Reinhard Gupfinger is another collaborator doing the PhD with me. He's also going in this area. He's more into sound art and sound installations and street art. But recently he created a work called Sound Shifting, where it's all about the sculptural representation of sound as such. So this is just a simple sound sculpture showing a recording of sound, but that's as such not so exciting. But he created a kind of machinery, interactive machinery, where he could create those representations in real time, more or less. So he would be at the place, would record a concert of Jens, for example, and create this sound sculpture as a physical remembrance of that concert and as a sculptural representation. To finalize, at the lab, what we are doing is mostly something which is called artistic research. So we are, on the one hand, not real engineers, on the other hand, not real artists. We are kind of in between. And the good thing in this area is that we can kind of, in this limbo, we can develop our own scientific and artistic methodologies. And in Austria, we are quite happy about that. There's a special funding program for these activities where we can develop this artistic research methodologies. It's called PIC, Programm zur Erforschung und Erschließung der Künste. And we have been recently starting a few projects in that area. And to conclude, I just want to show you this one because it's a bit out of the scope of today's topic. Is one project called Meta Music in collaboration with an artist collective called Alien Production. And with them, we are developing musical instruments for gray parrots, for animals. So it's musical, human, animal, machine interaction, which is quite exciting. But if you look at it, it looks a bit strange at the first place. But if you think about it, it's more or less the same challenge. If you design for, let's say, human-centered design for a human being, you think of certain cognitive and bodily abilities of that species, no? And if you break that down to a gray parrot, which is a very intelligent and a very agile and a very musical species, then you have a certain set of again, capabilities and cognitive capabilities, and you design for that as a kind of animal-centered design approach. And what we hope from the project is that we maybe can derive certain design patterns, what the generic musical instrument design could bring. This is our new logo, we're still setting up the website, but the logo at least we already have. So if you want to look at our more project, what we're doing, you can check that out there. So thanks for listening. I don't know, we can continue in English and German as whatever you want.
I think we should stick to it.
Okay.
Okay, any other questions? Well, the first questions, I mean. Marius, komm, oder not Dorothy? 1 second.
So the usual suspects of...
Yeah, oh, sorry. Thank you for the talk, it was great. One question that always concerns me, or not concerns me, but that always pops into my head when I see electronic instruments is something you kind of touched upon as well, is that, so acoustic instruments have a very high learning curve. It takes a long while to make something sound good with an acoustic instrument. The first time you pick it up, you're not immediately good at it. And I see a lot of digital instruments or electronic instruments that have a lower entry level for making something sound good. But then I always wonder, where do you go from there? Is there still a learning curve? Is there a way to make those complex kind of pieces that you would want to make with an acoustic instrument on those kinds of
this is a very important question. We have been dealing all the time with it. So first of all, yes, you're right. So if you build a new musical instrument, nobody is willing spending 15 years, like with a violin, to learn that instrument, which may be rendered obsolete in 5 years from now, right? So people would not need to this kind of really develop fine motoric and artistic skills on a certain instrument. So you need to offer this low entrance fee somehow that they can get a rewarding experience in a certain way. But actually, also with acoustic instruments, you would have this problem. So if you think of a kazoo, for example, no? A kazoo has a very low entrance fee. No? You can go there and play immediately, but on the other hand, it has a very low musical depth. So you cannot go further from that as you entered, right? So the problem we're facing is that providing a low entrance fee, so you can have a kind of rewarding experience in the first place and things go more or less okay. But at the same time, you should be able to still, if you want, spend those 15 years and have the necessary musical depth that you still discover new things. And actually, with the Rectable, we tried that. So on the one hand, you can make noise and people are having fun with it. But at the same time, it's, for example, due to the simple structure of the elements, so it's easy to understand what each element does. But by combining the element, you can really create infinite variations. And that's, for me, for example, still an experience that when I create a new structure, a new set, for example, I said, oh, that sounds good, and I try to memorize it and learn a new way of playing it. So that's a very important thing, that on the one hand, you make it easy to enter, but you keep on this depth somehow, that it's not just, let's say, a sound toy or something like that. And the other thing which is also in that discussion is this kind of instant reward, instant gratification idea, and that's what we are doing also with the parrots. So this was one of the reasons why we're working with them, because we are working with animal shelter in near Vienna in Vösendorf, and they gave us very strict ethical guidelines of what we can do with the parrots, because usually a mad evil scientist like me would go and imprint behaviors and train them with nuts and whatever. So that's what people do. Neuroscientists, for example, I was talking to some other neuroscientists, they were working with birds, with finches, and they would hatch them from the egg and imprint behaviors on them, and they can do that, of course, because that's, well, maybe not even unethical, but that's something you kind of program the bird to behavior. So we're not allowed to do that, so we have to work actually with birds which have been there for 30 years. They're very old already. Parrots get very old. And they already have a past, so they have had like their owner died, and then they end up in the shelter. Some of them have like also psychological problems and so on. So it's a really weird crowd of birds. And what we need to do in this design, so we cannot train them, we cannot imprint, of course, because they're old enough already. So what we have to do, we have to offer them an experience, and actually that's the scope of the project as well, which enriches the environment more or less, which enriches the everyday activities. And since they are very acoustic animals and very musical animals, so they can understand pitch, they can understand rhythm and so on, so they engage with musical activities, and we tried some experiments with that. So long story short is that what we do for the parrots, we have to achieve for the human being as well. We have to make something which gives this instant gratification, but engages people enough that you keep on training yourself. And the reward is not the nut, but the reward is the musical outcome, more or less, of it. So that's why it's quite exciting to work with the animals, because it becomes much more clearer there than in the human counterpart.
Great. Thank you.
My question would be, I think I love this idea of the information embodiment, which I think is a very, very good word for what we see on the React table. But I also think that there, as Doro said before, there are a lot of trained musicians who have kind of a notion for a more physical interaction with the instrument, and there is some memory that's inside the body which kind of extends the memory or the thinking of the brain. And I wonder if this is just really a tradition that we should not think of anymore, or if the digital instruments will at some point again provide this really physical direct interaction to the sound. I was on a talk in Linz, I think two weeks ago, and there was Alex from the Chicks on Speed, and she said we should just burn all the old instruments, and that would really make our spirit go.
And only play with the high heel shoes she makes.
Yes. So, do you have an opinion on that?
Well, I think the first part you said was pretty much the scope of my talk today in the end. So this is kind of the idea of post-digital instrument design. No? So try to recover the good from traditional instrument design, also let's say, which is mostly also this physicality, this more like a much more intimate relationship to an instrument. So for example, if you would have playing a saxophone, you would have your spit and everything in there. No, it's a very intimate and bodily experience, which is on the other hand with the computer completely abstracted. So what we did with the React table was an intermediate step. It's also still a very technocentric approach, some a very, let's say, abstract representation of electronic music with cubes, very clear, and it's visual representations. But actually, when we designed it in the first place, we had many ideas, so we get brainstorming and so on, and haptic feedback and different materialities was a very important step for us. We reduced it to this really slick cube acrylic design much more later because it was cheaper to make and was also having a, let's say, more interesting visual appearance when you look at it. No? But when we, for example, I was making experiments for these representations of sound, which are very similar to Thomas Grill, I think you know him, where he was researching also this kind of mapping between materialities and sonic experiences somehow. So we were doing similar things, so as making object which has felt on it, or sanding paper, or whatever, so different materials, metal and plastic. So we tried to represent the kind of what you would hear, with a more haptic, passive thing. No? And then, of course, you could go further and have active haptics like force feedback things and vibrations and so on. So if you have the time, money, and patience and knowledge, you should put this kind of multimodal experience. That's the task of post-digital design somehow. No? The good thing is that now with this maker culture, you can buy computers and microcontrollers of the size of a fingernail, no? And they're powerful like a Amiga from the 1990s. So you can do a lot of things with that. Huh? And that's the challenge now, that we are reached a point where technically even non-skilled person can really make smart objects and make them interactive and make, let's say, as I said in the beginning, the physical environment more reactive in a certain way. But of course, that's work and still a lot of things to do. And I think maybe one last comment to that. So people like the Media Lab, no, which actually coined this like Ishii, who coined the term of tangible interfaces, they recently also moved to this idea of radical atoms, which is going to that idea that you have, let's say, a kind of science fiction idea of programmable matter, no? That in the end you could really, because that's a drawback of physical interaction somehow, because on the screen you can make things appear and disappear and make them jump around in a way, whatever you want, no? But you cannot program reality in that way. But that's something you could wish for if you would make the perfect digital embodiment somehow, no? But actually we're getting there pretty well. So you can make it smaller, you can make really small elements and smart objects and so on. So that's also possible. And so the idea, to last comment, is that bring back many things, of course, of this intimate physical interaction with traditional instruments would be good.
So hello, Martin. Thank you for the great talk. I have a bunch of questions. I reduce it to two. Okay. The first one would be if you play an instrument, and if you play it good, the richness of playing the instrument comes through the errors I make when I play the instrument. And so I create the kind of atmosphere. And within the digital world, it's really hard to make errors in that sense because it's digital in the one or in the other way. So the first question would be, did you include these kinds of errors or the possibilities of making errors in that way with respect to the Rectangle project?
Oh yes, so actually in the videos it looks very slick, but there are many different unexpected behaviors in there, which on one hand we try, of course, as an engineer, we try to fix those behaviors to make them right. On the other hand, some of those behaviors were unfixable, like the optic and tracking, stability, and so on. So it also even a digital interface, and in this case, this hybrid of a digital interface, always has this thing what you would have like a personality from an analog synthesizer as well, no? Because the circuits are always different and so on. Even with digital interfaces, you can have that, these kind of behaviors and kind of things you would attribute that it's something which is not meant to be like that, but it emerges somehow from the combination of failing technologies and failing users in a certain way as well. So the Rectangle has a lot of those things, and you deal with those things. For example, sometimes if you have some fly shit on an optical symbol, and it would be just like dirt on that symbol, it would decay the quality of tracking, right? So it's lost sometimes, and you deal with this kind of glitches in a digital interface in the same way that you would deal in an analog traditional instrument. So if you make a mistake by playing, then you play over it. You're basically, the best thing you can do, you repeat the mistake again. So suddenly when you repeat it, it becomes a musical structure again. No? And that's what you can do also with a digital interface. So it's the same thing. Actually, I think that the term post-digital, since it's the topic of the day, was coined first time, I think, from Gary Scarvone or something like this in the late 90s. And he was actually referring to that very thing of glitch, this kind of error in the digital, environment. But I'm using it in a different way.
But that doesn't seem to be imposed in the structure of the element on purpose by you. So that's rather, it happened.
Yeah, but that's always the case. So you hardly, of course, you could make, on the one hand, of course, we tried, of course, in a certain way to fix that error because they're also annoying, right? But if they're kind of below a certain threshold of being annoying, then you could call them personality, right? That's the behavior of the thing which you cannot control, but which also fits very nicely somehow in the musical structure, if you can deal with it, of course. But it's the same thing, I don't know, with a normal instrument. If something is broken or if you make a mistake, you have to deal with it, right?
That comes to the second question, which is completely unrelated to the first one. I realized that all of your PhDs you mentioned here are male students.
I'm fixing that already. I have like two female candidates coming. Two female candidates? Okay. So actually, this is a historical development because they came with me from the other lab we have been working in. But now I'm actually, because I'm accepting new PhD students, I'm talking to a German-Chinese student, Echo Ho is her name, and she is going to work in this idea of hybrid traditional Chinese instrument using the gestural canon on what has been developed over centuries for that traditional instrument, the kin, and she's going to translate that gesture canon onto anything. So you could play the chin on a dog, for example, or something like that. So that's going to be very interesting. And then I'm also talking to Sabine Ahn. She is more a noise musician, and she's going to have this hybrid bio-art using her own cells and extracting noise from them and making. So because what I'm trying to do, I try to touch different genres, and in Echo, I think she's going to work this genre of traditional instrument transferred to contemporary post-digital practice, and Sabina is working with the body and the cell and bio-art. And then actually I'm talking to, I think she was mentioned before, to Alex from Jigs on Speed as well. She's maybe doing a postdoc with us. So we're going to have 50-50.
Anyone else? Yeah, I had a question. It was not apparent to me when you showed the video. How do you address the time axis in that interface? Like because normally I'm used to sound interfaces where it goes from left to right and then continues.
So this would be the element of the sequencer you're referring. So that, of course, when you have that sequence element, which we saw in the performance of the Italian guy, which was just
on the right hand side,
yeah, it was just this melody element. But what you can do there is actually you can pop up a visual representation of this time structure and then just program it on the touch screen, basically. That's basically there, the sequencer structure, these time steps. And with the sequencer, actually, which I've shown later, which I'm doing together with Jens, there we have this physical representation of the sequence. So we have this timeline, which is basically an 8-step sequencer, and you put the little blocks on that timeline, and then the sweep is actually a LED light, which is running over that. So it's very simple structure, which has been done in many ways, actually. So this physical token-based sequencers, I think they're like 20 years old. People have been doing it all the time because it's a very obvious thing. What we are doing with that, we are, as I mentioned briefly, is we are trying to increase the complexity of that to create different layers. Having kind of layers in Windows which you can pre-program on the side and then put it there and then put another one. So on, so on. But anyway, so this is on the rec table. This timeline of the sequencer is visual only, as a touch screen interface, and on the sequence is a physical representation, which is again, just to get into the professor mode, is again the idea of the token, which is the sound event on the interface, and the reference frame, which is basically the device itself, which gives basically that idea of 8-step sequencer going from left to right.
Any more questions? I think we have time for one or two more.
We know each other.
Yes.
And I knew your stuff before, but I didn't have that question before. And it was like, have you ever thought of the practice of rehearsing? Like, how could you improve that? For example, on a React table, was there at any point any chance that you sort of record a timeline and then you were able to sort of play back that again and see some kind of representation of the tokens on the thing to rethink of what did I do there? Could have tried different things and then kind of rearrange that and change that and save it again and see how it changed and kind of, because these steps are kind of now easier in a digital way than in an analog way. So have you ever tried or experienced anything in that?
Yeah, so we have been thinking about this a lot. The thing is that, I said it before, so with the graphical interface, you mentioned it too, you can really make things appear and disappear. You can load a preset and it just appears on the screen. This can be done also, of course, on the rec table. You could load a preset and it appears on the screen and it's there and you have that done. But then again, you would need to put the objects on them to make it work. So you have this, what we call this physical persistence hammer. You cannot make things appear and you cannot make them disappear unless you have really this programmable atomic structure, whatever holodeck, what you would need for that, right? So in this case, we thought, okay, for example, we were thinking about not for practice, but for in PD and Max, you would have this idea of a sub-patch, right? You would have a structure, and then you represent that structure again with a single object. So we have been thinking of all those things, no? But again, this problem is you could do it. For example, we thought about the structure. So we put the structure there, then we put the new objects, then we draw a gesture around it, then it would be sucked up. But then again, those guys would be deactivated and still be there, right? And you would take them away. And so we decided not to go for it in the end. So what we said, okay, the rec table as such, you need to of course, you can save certain configurations, like what kind of sequence is in a sequence object, what kind of sample is in a sample object, what kind of oscillator is in an oscillator object, and so on. You can save those things, and it will be loaded again. But the physical configuration itself, that's something you have as a human being. That's your task. So you have to memorize those structures again. So when you say rehearsing, what we did, so I mentioned it also briefly, so when for example, I would kind of improvise myself, and then I would find a structure, I don't know, a rhythmic structure, and so on, and say, oh, I liked it. And then I would look at it, what did I do here? And then I would try to memorize that configuration and what's there, right? And that would become a structure which goes into my repertoire of knowledge somehow. And if I then would recreate it in an improvisation setting, then I would try to memorize the thing and recreate it, and it would do more or less the same, yeah? On the other hand, if it would be a composition, what we also did, then we would make really screenshots and annotations. So we would make a kind of a graphical score where we would have a screenshot of what was on the table, and then we would make annotation, and the piece would be a bunch of papers which has that thing on it and annotations, and you go from one figure to the next, and that would be the piece somehow. Yeah, but for rehearsing, that's something is more the discovering of the structures and then memorizing them. That's the thing.
Okay, last question, Marius.
I think with the technologies possible, maybe in a couple of years already possible, where you put chips into your body and they kind of connect to your body, and the nerves kind of have the possibility to interact, not in a physical way, but just with kind of nerves. How important do you think is the aspect of the physical interaction? And if you think it's important, why is it so important to still use the body, or wouldn't it be enough to use the brain alone?
Well, of course, so I was putting up this virtual reality thing. So if you make this virtual reality perfect and create the stimuli in a certain way that you have the visual, acoustic, and haptic, whatever stimuli, in a way that it's so close to the real interaction that you would feel it, then it's maybe good. But actually, there's some research which indicates the other thing. For example, everybody would know the movie with Minority Report, right? And there you have this, what in the early 2000s was this futuristic interface of a guy waving in the air and so on. And it's this kind of gestural interaction, which just looks cool, and people were doing with the Kinect or do this jumping and waving, which I call Fuchtel interfaces, which is very good. And it's in some areas, like especially like gaming and so on, it really makes sense because there is the exercise. But for example, the typical thing of Minority Report, that's ergonomically a complete nonsense, because you would not imagine to stand like the whole day with your arms up. And actually, there's research, we call it the gorilla arm effect, that only after 20 minutes would get a sore arm by doing that. So even if you would have a stimulus maybe for having a completely virtualized interaction, you would still deal with the problems of your body as such, and it may not work the way you would imagine. It would have this kind of uncanny things, which is now already there anyway. So, for example, this kind of disconnection of the self awareness to the visual stimuli you get just sick from it. And if you do it really heavily on the body, I think it's going to be difficult too. So if it doesn't really match too well. But of course, it could be a way to go. But I think the gorilla arm effect is a very simple and illustrative example of what the problems are there. Although on the one hand, it seems very natural that you wave your hand all the time. But if you do that for 20 minutes, you just get bored of it. And you're just, as a human being, you're really made for interacting with physical things. That's what you do. That's why I put also up this baby picture, because that's what we do. We put things into our mouth to interact and learn about the physical environment. And that doesn't work in the purely virtual representation.
Thank you, Martin.
Dankeschön.